Doesn't take a genius to see the world has problems.
Yeah, but it takes a room full of morons who think they're small enough for you to handle.
Unfilmable. It's a word you hear from time to time within the realms of film culture, usually describing adaptations too ambitious to make it through the filmmaking process. Lord of the Rings, Life of Pi, The Never-Ending Story. Filming the unfilmable is like the ultimate Hollywood challenge. Well, that and starting a successful cinematic universe, apparently. Plenty of projects have been bestowed this made-up word, and before 2009, one graphic novel held the mantle like a badge of honor. That book was Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' 1986 12-issue miniseries, Watchmen. But as you already know, Warner Brothers, Zack Snyder, and an army of creative forces took on the challenge anyway. Not even a year after Iron Man and The Dark Knight kicked off this golden age of superhero movies, the so-called comic that changed comics was finally brought to the silver screen after spending decades in development hell. And the film was received, decently, I guess? Critics were okay with it, but it was not the box office takeoff the studio wanted, and it now remains this bizarre footnote in superhero film history. Congratulations, you filmed the unfilmable, and the result is, fine. Mind you, it wasn't for a lack of trying. Watchmen was a heavily marketed blockbuster, with a game cast, a strong creative team, and an accomplished filmmaker at its center. And yet, something's not right. Why? What exactly is going on here? It's been 9 long years since the Watchmen movie, and I want some answers. To start, I'd just like to make something clear. I do not care about adaptation accuracy. Like seriously, I can't think of a worse criticism against a movie or a TV show or a video game than something like, it doesn't follow the book, it doesn't follow the comic, he doesn't look and sound enough like Harrison Ford, that kind of thing. However, the conversation changes when you're talking about intent. If someone openly intends to adapt something as accurately as possible, then yeah, I think it's totally fair game to judge the work as such. For example, director Chris Columbus had every intention of keeping the first 2 Harry Potter films as close to the novels as possible, so the films can and should absolutely be examined through that lens. Such is also the case with Watchmen. Zack Snyder not only loved the comic, but hoped his adaptation would be a full-blown advertisement for the original book. But if you've watched the movie, you know it isn't a complete reflection of the book. Watchmen's color palette, subplotting, and climax greatly stray from the source material. But I don't think that's why the film fumbles as an adaptation. No, for an adaptation to fail, it has to be more than just accuracy, and Watchmen failed in a way I've never seen in any other adaptive work, and it does so in the first few minutes. Regardless if you're reading or watching it, Watchmen begins with the murder of Edward Blake, the comedian. He's thrown out of his apartment window and reaches terminal velocity before greeting the ground, killing him instantly. The book frames the murder as a flashback, depicting Blake's beatdown as quick, quiet, and completely one-sided. But in the film, we watch the scuffle between Eddie Blake and his assailant in real time, giving him a chance to fight back. And within this opening, this first glimpse into the Watchmen world, this happens. They gave the Watchmen superpowers. Not even big, bombastic powers, just a slight increase in strength noticeable enough to catch your attention. To those unfamiliar, this sounds irrelevant, even a given. But seriously, this is the adaptation's fundamental flaw. If you're confused, that's fine. In the spirit of the book, let's do a quick flashback and talk about the comic's creation, and more importantly, the intent behind it. So back in the early 1980s, DC acquired a bunch of characters from a little publisher called Charlton Comics. Writer Alan Moore wanted to use these characters for a standalone miniseries, but DC wanted to include its new toys in its own shared universe. So Moore and artist Dave Gibbons came up with a bunch of doppelgangers instead, who became the Watchmen. Or the crime busters, if you want to be technical about it. Moore had a very specific reason for using the Charlton characters. Most of them were conceived by Spider-Man co-creator Steve Ditko, and they were also among the very few comic book superheroes who were openly political in their stories. You see, Ditko was, and remains, a strong supporter of Objectivism, a school of thought founded by Russian-American author Ayn Rand. I'm not going to recap all of Objectivism in this video because you and I have better things to do with our lives, so I'll keep this simple. Objectivism partly deals with a social hierarchy quietly defined by inherent superiority and a worldview that promotes black and white moralism. The most talented and special people in all the world should be able to do their talented and special things without any government oversight. Again, simplifying an entire school of thought here, but that's a big part of it. You want to know more? Go play BioShock or something. Ditko advocated Randian philosophy through his Charlton heroes, and gained a reputation for his explicit political preaching, to which Alan Moore took notice. As he confirmed in an interview many years after the fact, Moore partially designed Watchmen's story as a long-form dress-down of everything Ditko championed at Charlton, using the so-called superheroes that were modeled after Ditko's creations. Each of the Watchmen has an objectivist viewpoint. They believe they're above the law just because they think putting on a costume and beating up muggers somehow validates their authority.
We're society's only protection. We keep it up as long as we have to. Protection? Who are we protecting them from? From themselves.
The main force behind this deeply critical commentary comes down to what separates the Watchmen apart from the citizens they supposedly protect. That is to say, nothing. In the original book, the Watchmen do not have superpowers. Rorschach is just a guy in a mask. The comedian's just a buff dude with a lot of weapons experience. Night Owl's just a rich guy with a bunch of gadgets, and Silk Spectre has a good grasp on martial arts. Even Ozymandias, the guy who stops a bullet with his hand, just has incredible reflexes as a result of his intellect. None of these jerkwads have enhanced abilities, they just believe they're above the law because they call themselves superheroes. There's one exception, of course, Dr. Manhattan, who has actual godlike powers that rival even Superman's own abilities. But let me ask, if the only superhero with superpowers is a borderline sociopath who barely feels any connection with humanity, what does that say about the superheroes without any?
I am tired of this world, these people. I am tired of being caught in the tangle of their lives.
Hopefully, I'm illustrating why Watchmen is the most deconstructive comic book ever made. It takes the traditional laws of superheroes, the principles that have been imbued with them since Action Comics #1, drops them in the real world, and demonstrates what would happen. For all of its complex themes and motifs, Watchmen's grand takeaway is actually pretty simple. If superheroes were real, they would suck. So let's bring this back to the comedian's on-screen murder. For an audience, what we see in a movie's first 15 or 20 minutes is the lens through which we'll interpret everything else. So when we witness an old man punching a chunk of wall off and then immediately planting his fist through another wall, it tells us something. Super strength exists in this world. Suddenly, the context through which we view the world of Watchmen is set in stone. This is not the real world, and these characters have heightened abilities, which stands in stark contrast to a crucial part of the book's commentary. These characters are no longer presuming their own authority based on nothing. They now have a bit of power, thus bringing in a bit of responsibility. Our perspective has shifted, but the story has not.
I am tired of Earth. These people. I'm tired of being caught in the tangle of their lives.
Adding to this distorted depiction is the film's cinematically glorified violence. Watchmen's action sequences are famously shot with this slick, almost sexy slow motion effect, like the film is slowing down specifically to show you how awesome its characters are in the heat of battle. Watchmen is a tragic story, and the movie doesn't shy away from telling it, but in using this effect in its action, the film visually communicates the exact opposite of what the violence actually means. To paraphrase the best film essayist on YouTube, how we are shown something, and what it looks like is more important than what we're told it's supposed to be. Always, always, always. Rorschach is the most morally objectionable character in this group, yet the film's aesthetic paints him as a vigilante badass, which is an almost dangerous misreading of this damaged, violent, bigoted psychopath. This comic does not like its characters, but this movie thinks its characters are just the coolest. Same costumes, same personalities, same dialogue, but now with a drastically different perspective. The Watchmen characters no longer embody what the Watchmen comic was critiquing. On its own, the change is not necessarily a bad thing, but it becomes an issue when the story and characters built around that critique do not change with it. This backwards interpretation is made especially worse because of the circumstances surrounding this particular book's commentary. You see, Watchmen is a lot like Sonic the Hedgehog. I'm just gonna leave that statement as it is for a second. Okay, what I mean is both are reactionary works. Sonic is to Mario what Watchmen is to 50 years of comic book history, and that's one of the reasons why it made such an impact back in 1986. Subversion and satire are part of Watchmen's DNA. To remove it from your adaptation results in a hollow retelling that is enjoyable, but rarely meaningful. Watchmen does not fail as an adaptation because it's inaccurate. It fails because it cuts corners. It isolates the book's storytelling from the book's theming, changes only the latter, and expects the exact same results.
You know, for a guy who calls himself the comedian, I can never tell when you're joking.
Watchmen. That's the real joke.
This is the grand irony of the Watchmen film. It treats the original 12 issues like sacred text inscribed in stone, but what it never understands is that Watchmen was not carved into a surface, it was grown, made by the world around it. And in the film's desperate attempt to stay true to the source's visuals and speech bubbles, it missed the forest for the trees, crippling the parts that made the book so incredible in the first place. 9 years later, I finally understand. Watchmen doesn't get Watchmen. But there is something promising on the horizon. At the time of this video's release, the pilot for a Watchmen TV series is in production at HBO. Showrunner Damon Lindelof has described this adaptation as the New Testament to the original work, with new characters and a modern-day setting. By basing its story and world in a contemporary climate, this concept alone already feels more in line with Watchmen than the film's painstaking recreations ever did. Because it's not just the content, it's the context. The decades of superhero comics that came before it, the Cold War politics of the late 20th century, and the cultural anxieties coursing through the American consciousness at the time. The only way you can adapt Watchmen faithfully is if you also adapt the world that shaped it. And yeah, I guess that is pretty damn unfilmable.